Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of humanity's darkest chapters, the Great Plague of the 14th century, also known as the Black Death. Picture this. You're waking up in your cramped medieval dwelling, and the first thing that hits you isn't the smell of fresh bread or morning dew, but the stench of rotting rat carcasses littering your street. These aren't just any dead rats. They're the harbingers of something so catastrophic that it will reshape the entire fabric of European society. You're about to experience a pandemic that will kill roughly 1/3 of Europe's population. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. The odds are literally stacked against you in ways that would make modern lottery tickets look generous. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing our global community come together for these historical deep dives. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're living in 1347, and life was already pretty rough before this whole plague situation started spiraling out of control. Your typical day begins before sunrise because, let's face it, artificial lighting is basically non-existent unless you're wealthy enough to afford candles, which you're probably not. Most people are peasants scraping by on subsistence farming, and even the middle-class merchants and craftsmen live in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. The morning air carries an unusual tension today. Yesterday, old Henrik, the rat catcher, mentioned something odd about the rodents he'd been finding. Instead of the usual healthy specimens he'd trap and dispose of, he's been discovering them already dead, with strange black swellings and blood trickling from their mouths. You dismiss it as just another quirk of city life. After all, rats die all the time in medieval settlements. But as you step outside your dwelling, the scene before you is unlike anything you've witnessed before. The narrow, cobblestone streets that normally bustle with merchants hawking their wares and children playing crude games are eerily subdued. Rats, dozens of them, lie scattered across the thoroughfare like some macabre carpet. Their bodies are grotesquely swollen, and the smell is beginning to turn your stomach. Your neighbor, Martha, emerges from her home looking pale and shaken. She's clutching her youngest child close to her chest, and you notice her hands are trembling slightly. "Something's not right," she whispers, her voice barely audible above the distant church bells that have been ringing more frequently lately, though you haven't quite connected why yet. The local priest has been making more rounds than usual, and there's talk in the taverns about strange ships arriving at nearby ports with crews that are either dead or dying. Historians still argue whether the plague actually originated in Asia and traveled along trade routes. But what's becoming increasingly clear is that your small corner of the world is about to become ground zero for an unimaginable catastrophe. You try to go about your normal routine. Perhaps you're a baker kneading dough, a blacksmith tending your forge, or a seamstress working by candlelight. But concentration becomes impossible as more neighbors begin emerging from their homes, all wearing the same expression of confused dread. continue to accumulate in the streets, and now you're starting to notice that some of the local cats have begun dying too. By midday, the first human victim appears. It's Thomas the Cooper, a man known for his robust health and boisterous laugh. But now he's stumbling through the marketplace, his neck visibly swollen with dark, egg-sized lumps that seem to pulse with their own malevolent life. His skin has taken on a grayish pallor, and he's muttering incoherently about burning sensations throughout his body. The crowd that would normally gather to help a neighbor in distress instead instinctively backs away. There's something primordially terrifying about Thomas's condition that triggers every survival instinct you possess. Within hours, he's collapsed in the street, his body convulsing violently before falling completely still. And this is just the beginning of your nightmare. You're now facing an invisible enemy that defies every attempt at understanding. In an age where medical knowledge consists mainly of balancing bodily humors and consulting astrological charts, the plague presents symptoms that seem to mock conventional wisdom. The disease doesn't discriminate, it strikes the devout and the sinful, the rich and the poor, the young and the old, with equal viciousness. The swellings that appeared on Thomas have a name that will haunt your dreams: buboes. These grotesque lumps, primarily appearing in the groin, armpits, and neck, grow to the size of apples and turn black as they fill with infected blood and pus. But here's where it gets really fun. Sometimes they burst open spontaneously, releasing a stench so overwhelming that even hardened grave diggers flee in horror. Your local physician, Master Aldrich, arrives wearing his distinctive leather beak-shaped mask stuffed with aromatic herbs, a contraption he believes will protect him from the miasma, or bad air, that supposedly causes disease. Little do you know that this peculiar outfit will become one of history's most iconic images of medieval medicine. He examines the growing number of victims with increasing bewilderment, muttering Latin phrases and consulting ancient texts that offer no useful guidance. The symptoms evolve with terrifying unpredictability. Some victims develop fever and chills, so severe they alternate between feeling like they're burning alive and freezing to death within minutes. Others experience violent vomiting and diarrhea that leaves them completely dehydrated. The most disturbing cases develop a dry cough that produces blood-tinged sputum, spreading the disease through airborne droplets every time they breathe. But perhaps most unsettling is how quickly the plague kills. Unlike other diseases that might linger for weeks or months, this mysterious affliction can take someone from seemingly perfect health to death's door in a matter of days. You watch neighbors who were laughing and working just yesterday now lying motionless in their beds, their bodies already beginning to decompose. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was purely bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria, or if it included other diseases like anthrax or hemorrhagic fever that created a perfect storm of mortality. What you experience, however, is far more immediate and terrifying than any scholarly debate. You're watching your entire world dissolve into chaos. The disease seems to mock every attempt at prevention. Holy water, blessed amulets, and fervent prayers appear powerless against its advance. Some people try carrying flowers or herbs, believing pleasant scents will ward off the evil. Others resort to more extreme measures, like drinking their own urine or consuming ground unicorn horn, a substance that's actually just powdered narwhal tusk sold by unscrupulous merchants who know desperate people will pay anything for hope. Your community's wisest elder, a woman named Agnes, who survived famines, wars, and numerous outbreaks of less severe diseases, confesses she's never witnessed anything like this. "It's as if God has abandoned us," she whispers, her weathered hands shaking as she tends to her own grandchildren, who are beginning to show the first signs of infection. The plague's unpredictability becomes a source of constant terror. Some people develop the characteristic buboes and somehow survive, though they're left permanently weakened and scarred. Others seem to die almost instantly, sometimes collapsing mid-sentence while going about their daily activities. There's no pattern you can discern, no behavior that guarantees safety, no prayer that ensures protection. Medical attempts at treatment range from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting, already a questionable practice, becomes downright dangerous when applied to plague victims who are already suffering from internal bleeding. Physicians prescribe everything from crushed emeralds to boiled hedgehog skin, creating expensive placebo treatments that drain families' resources while providing no relief. As days turn into weeks, you realize that this isn't just a disease. It's a fundamental breakdown of everything you thought you understood about life, death, and divine justice. The plague has introduced an element of randomness and chaos that transforms your previously ordered medieval world into something resembling a waking nightmare where traditional rules no longer apply. You're discovering that medieval cities, which seemed crowded and unsanitary during normal times, become absolute death traps during a pandemic. The narrow, winding streets that once provided charming intimacy now feel like inescapable corridors of contagion. Buildings lean so close together that you can literally reach across the street and touch your neighbor's window, which means disease spreads faster than gossip at a church social. Your typical medieval city lacks any coherent sanitation system. Human and animal waste gets dumped directly into the streets, where it mingles with rotting food scraps, dead animals, and now, increasingly, human corpses. The smell alone would knock out a modern person, but you've become somewhat accustomed to it over the years. However, the plague adds new layers of olfactory horror that challenge even your hardened medieval nose. Water sources become contaminated almost immediately. The local well, which serves dozens of families, sits dangerously close to the growing pile of bodies that nobody seems capable of properly disposing of anymore. You're faced with an impossible choice: drink potentially infected water or die of dehydration. Most people choose the water and hope for the best, which rarely works out in their favor. The city's population density, which seemed manageable during peaceful times, now works against everyone's survival. In rural areas, families might have some chance of isolating themselves from infected neighbors. But in your urban environment, you're literally stacked on top of each other like medieval sardines. The family upstairs is coughing blood. The neighbors next door haven't emerged from their home in 3 days, and the apartment below yours has started smelling like a battlefield. Waste management, never a strong point of medieval urban planning, completely collapses under the strain. The few professional waste collectors have either died or fled the city, leaving mountains of garbage to accumulate in courtyards and alleyways. These festering piles become breeding grounds for the rats and fleas that serve as the plague's primary transmission vectors, creating a vicious cycle of contamination. Your city's layout, designed for defense against human enemies rather than microscopic ones, becomes a liability. High walls that once protected against invading armies now trap you inside with the disease. Gates that would normally allow free movement are either sealed shut by panicking authorities or guarded by increasingly desperate soldiers who shoot first and ask questions later. The marketplace, once the vibrant heart of your community, transforms into something resembling a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Vendors' stalls stand abandoned, their goods rotting in the sun, while their owners lie dead or dying. The few merchants still attempting to conduct business wear crude face coverings and refuse to handle coins directly, using long wooden poles to maintain distance from customers. Housing conditions that were merely uncomfortable during normal times become nightmarish during the pandemic. Most people live in single-room dwellings shared with extended family members, farm animals, and whatever pests have decided to take up residence. When plague strikes a household, there's nowhere to isolate the sick, so entire families often die within days of each other. The city's few physicians and clergy, who might normally provide some guidance during crisis, are either dead, dying, or have fled to their country estates. This leaves you and your neighbors to figure out survival strategies without any expert guidance. Folk remedies and superstitions fill the knowledge vacuum, leading to practices that range from merely useless to actively dangerous. Historians still argue whether urban centers experienced higher mortality rates than rural areas during the Black Death. But from your street-level perspective, the city feels like a carefully designed torture chamber. Every aspect of urban life that once provided convenience, community, and protection now serves to amplify the plague's devastating effects. Your neighbors begin exhibiting behaviors that would seem insane during normal times, but make perfect sense given the circumstances. Some barricade themselves inside their homes, refusing all contact with the outside world. Others engage in frantic cleaning rituals, scrubbing their dwellings with vinegar and burning aromatic herbs around the clock. A few embrace fatalistic hedonism, reasoning that if death is inevitable, they might as well enjoy their final days. The urban infrastructure that took generations to develop crumbles within weeks. Bridges go unmaintained, roads become impassable due to abandoned carts and decomposing animals, and public buildings stand empty except for rats and corpses. Your once thriving city begins resembling something from the apocalypse, and you're starting to wonder if civilization itself might be ending. You're about to discover that medieval medical treatment during the plague makes modern alternative medicine look like cutting-edge science. The physicians available to treat your community operate under theories that are not just wrong, but spectacularly, dangerously wrong in ways that would be hilarious if people weren't dying from the treatments. Master Aldrich, your local physician, firmly believes that disease results from an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. His solution to almost every plague symptom involves bloodletting, deliberately draining blood from patients who are already dying from internal bleeding. He uses leeches, makes incisions with rusty knives, and sometimes just opens veins with whatever sharp object happens to be handy. The irony is that bloodletting actually weakens patients' immune systems at the exact moment they need every ounce of strength to fight the infection. But Master Aldrich interprets his patient's declining condition as proof that they need more bloodletting, not less. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline while insisting that you just haven't used enough gasoline yet. Uroscopy becomes another cornerstone of plague diagnosis, despite being completely useless. Physicians examine patients' urine color, smell, and even taste. Yes, they actually taste it to determine the appropriate treatment. A slightly yellowish tint might indicate excess yellow bile, requiring a purgative that will cause violent diarrhea. Cloudy urine suggests too much phlegm, leading to treatments designed to make patients vomit uncontrollably. The pharmaceutical options available to you read like a medieval comedy sketch. Physicians prescribe powdered unicorn horn, which is actually ground narwhal tusk that costs more than most families earn in a year. Theriac, a supposed cure-all containing dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh and opium, gets mixed into a paste that tastes horrible and provides no medical benefit whatsoever. Some treatments venture into truly bizarre territory. Physicians recommend placing a live chicken against plague buboes, believing the bird will somehow absorb the disease. Others suggest drinking wine mixed with crushed pearls, reasoning that something so valuable must possess healing properties. A few particularly creative healers prescribe wearing amulets made from toad skin or carrying bags of aromatic herbs in your armpits. The plague treatises written by learned physicians read like fever dreams. One renowned doctor recommends bathing in urine, then wrapping yourself in cloth soaked with pig fat. Another suggests drilling holes in patients' skulls to release evil vapors, a practice called trepanation that somehow manages to make the plague seem like the lesser of two evils. Astronomical medicine plays a significant role in plague treatment, with physicians consulting star charts to determine the most auspicious times for various procedures. Your treatment schedule might depend on whether Mercury is in retrograde, or if Venus is properly aligned with Jupiter. This means that effective treatments get delayed, while useless ones are rushed based on celestial timing that has absolutely nothing to do with medicine. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed in their treatments or simply used them to maintain professional authority during a crisis they couldn't understand. From your perspective as a patient, however, the distinction is meaningless. You're receiving treatments that range from useless to actively harmful while your condition continues deteriorating. The few treatments that might actually help get dismissed as folk remedies unworthy of learned physicians. Keeping patients clean, providing fresh air, and ensuring adequate nutrition, basic supportive care that could improve survival odds, are ignored in favor of complex procedures that sound impressive but accomplish nothing positive. Religious medical practices blend seamlessly with secular ones, creating hybrid treatments that combine the worst aspects of both approaches. Priests prescribe holy water enemas, while physicians recommend bleeding patients at specific points corresponding to astrological charts. The result is a treatment regimen that manages to be simultaneously sacrilegious and scientifically worthless. Some patients become so desperate that they seek treatment from anyone claiming medical knowledge, regardless of qualifications. Traveling charlatans arrive in plague-stricken cities, selling miracle cures that consist mainly of colored water, ground-up weeds, and optimistic thinking. These fraudulent healers often charge desperate families their life savings for treatments that provide nothing but false hope. The medical establishment's complete failure to address the plague effectively destroys public confidence in professional health care for generations. People begin trusting folk healers, wise women, and even random neighbors over trained physicians, leading to a medical dark age that persists long after the plague itself has ended. You're witnessing the complete breakdown of social structures that took centuries to develop. The plague doesn't just kill individuals, it systematically destroys the bonds that hold communities together, leaving you surrounded by neighbors who have transformed from helpful allies into potential threats. The first casualty is trust. That friendly baker who used to give your children extra bread now eyes your family with suspicion, wondering if you might be carrying the disease. Your longtime neighbor, Martha, no longer borrows cooking ingredients or shares gossip over the garden fence. Instead, she crosses the street when she sees you coming and speaks to you only from a distance of at least 20 feet. Social hierarchies that seemed permanent begin crumbling almost immediately. The local lord, who normally commands absolute respect and obedience, has barricaded himself in his manor with a handful of loyal servants. Meanwhile, his peasants, who are supposedly bound to the land and to his service, begin making their own decisions about where to go and what to do. Some abandon their fields entirely, reasoning that if they're going to die anyway, they might as well die free. The church, which typically serves as the community's moral and social anchor, struggles to maintain authority as plague devastates the clergy. Priests who preach about divine mercy and protection die at the same rates as everyone else, raising uncomfortable questions about whether God is listening to prayers, or if the church's teachings about suffering and redemption actually mean anything when faced with mass death. economic relationships that once seemed stable become chaotic. Employers can't find workers because half their workforce is dead or dying. Workers who do survive suddenly find themselves in high demand and begin demanding higher wages, better working conditions, and more respect, demands that would have been unthinkable during normal times, but now seem perfectly reasonable given the circumstances. Marriage and family bonds, supposedly sacred and unbreakable, face unprecedented strain. Husbands abandon sick wives, parents flee from infected children, and grown children refuse to care for elderly parents. The plague forces people to choose between loyalty to loved ones and personal survival, and the results reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature that challenge every idealistic belief about family devotion. Legal systems collapse as judges, lawyers, and court officials die or flee. Property disputes go unresolved, contracts become meaningless, and criminal behavior increases as people realize there are no longer sufficient authorities to maintain order. Some communities attempt to establish informal justice systems, but these often devolve into vigilante violence that's barely distinguishable from random chaos. The guild system, which normally regulates trade and crafts, breaks down completely. Master craftsmen die before they can train apprentices, taking valuable knowledge and skills to their graves. Apprentices abandon their training to pursue more immediately profitable activities like grave digging or corpse disposal, jobs that suddenly offer steady employment and decent wages. Historians still argue whether the Black Death's social disruption ultimately benefited common people by breaking down oppressive feudal structures. But from your immediate perspective, the collapse feels utterly terrifying. The predictable social roles and relationships that once provided stability and meaning have vanished, leaving you to navigate a world where traditional rules no longer apply. Class distinctions begin blurring in unexpected ways. Wealthy merchants who lose their fortunes to plague-related business failures might find themselves working alongside former servants in the few remaining jobs available. Meanwhile, some clever peasants who manage to survive discover opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Community celebrations and gatherings, which once brought people together and reinforced social bonds, become impossible. Festivals are canceled. Markets operate sporadically with greatly reduced attendance, and even religious services become dangerous gatherings where disease spreads rapidly among the faithful. The shared experiences that once created community identity disappear, leaving isolated individuals struggling to maintain connections with their neighbors. The breakdown of social norms extends to basic courtesy and civility. People who once exchanged pleasantries and helped each other with daily tasks now interact with barely concealed hostility and suspicion. Children, who normally learn social skills through interaction with adults and peers, grow up during the plague years without proper socialization, creating long-term cultural changes that persist even after the disease itself has passed. Some communities attempt to maintain solidarity through mutual aid and cooperation, But these efforts often fail as resources become scarce and trust erodes. What begins as organized assistance for plague victims deteriorates into competition for survival resources, turning former allies into desperate competitors, willing to do almost anything to protect their own families. You're watching centuries of economic development collapse faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. The plague doesn't just kill people, it systematically destroys every economic system that medieval society depends on for survival, leaving you scrambling to find new ways to obtain basic necessities like food, shelter, and clothing. Trade, the lifeblood of medieval commerce, virtually disappears overnight. Merchant caravans that once crisscrossed Europe, carrying goods between cities, now sit abandoned along roadsides, their operators either dead or too terrified to continue traveling. Ships arrive in harbors with entire crews dead, their valuable cargoes rotting in holds that no one dares to enter for fear of infection. Your local market, once a bustling center of economic activity, becomes a ghost town. The few vendors who still attempt to sell goods operate under bizarre conditions, shouting prices from a distance, refusing to handle money directly, and using long sticks to pass items to customers. Prices fluctuate wildly from day to day as supply and demand lose all connection to rational economic principles. Currency itself becomes problematic. Coins that might have passed through the hands of plague victims are viewed with suspicion, leading some communities to temporarily abandon money altogether in favor of barter systems. You might trade a chicken for a bag of grain, then exchange that grain for a pair of shoes, creating complex chains of transactions that would make modern economists weep. Agricultural production, already vulnerable due to medieval farming techniques, faces complete collapse in many regions. Entire villages die out, leaving crops to rot in the fields because there's no one left to harvest them. The few surviving farmers often abandon their land to seek safety in cities, not realizing that urban areas are even more dangerous than rural ones. Artisan crafts that took generations to develop vanish as master craftspeople die without passing on their knowledge. The secret techniques for creating specific types of metalwork, textiles, or pottery disappear forever when their practitioners succumb to plague. This represents not just economic loss, but the permanent destruction of cultural knowledge that can never be recovered. Labor shortages become so severe that basic services simply stop functioning. There aren't enough people to maintain roads, repair buildings, or even dispose of garbage and human waste. The few workers who do survive suddenly find themselves in incredibly high demand, leading to wage increases that would have been unimaginable during normal times. Banking and credit systems, already primitive by modern standards, become completely unreliable. Moneylenders die, taking knowledge of outstanding debts with them to their graves. Record-keeping systems break down as clerks and scribes succumb to plague, leaving financial obligations in permanent legal limbo that takes decades to sort out. wool trade, one of medieval Europe's most important industries, faces devastating disruption. Sheep die from lack of care when their shepherds succumb to plague, while the complex international networks that moved raw wool from England to Flemish weavers completely break down. Entire regions that depended on textile production find themselves economically ruined. Historians still argue whether the economic disruption caused by the Black Death ultimately led to positive changes like higher wages for surviving workers. But from your immediate perspective, the collapse feels catastrophic. Everything you once counted on for economic security, your job, your employer, your local market, your community's trade relationships, has either disappeared entirely or become unreliable. Some people attempt to profit from the crisis by hoarding essential goods and selling them at inflated prices. Grain merchants who stockpile wheat while their neighbors starve become wealthy in the short term, but they also become targets for desperate people willing to use violence to obtain food for their families. The construction industry, which normally provides steady employment for large numbers of workers, grinds to a halt. There's no point in building new structures when existing buildings sit empty due to their owners dying. Meanwhile, maintenance of existing infrastructure becomes impossible due to labor shortages, leading to a general deterioration of the built environment. International trade networks that took centuries to establish collapse within months. The Silk Road, the Hanseatic League, and Mediterranean commercial routes all face severe disruption. As cities close their ports, merchants die, and political authorities prioritize isolation over economic activity. These disruptions create ripple effects that impact communities thousands of miles away from the initial plague outbreaks. Tax collection becomes nearly impossible as both taxpayers and tax collectors die in large numbers. This creates fiscal crises for governments that depend on regular revenue to maintain basic services like law enforcement and public works. Some regions effectively become ungoverned territories where economic activity reverts to primitive subsistence patterns. You're experiencing a crisis of faith that shakes the very foundations of medieval Christianity. The plague forces you to confront uncomfortable questions about divine justice, the power of prayer, and whether God has abandoned humanity entirely. Your entire worldview, built around the belief that good behavior leads to divine protection, crumbles as you watch devout believers die while apparent sinners survive. The local clergy, who normally provide spiritual guidance and comfort during difficult times, are dying at rates that match or exceed the general population. Father Benedict, who baptized your children and provided counsel during family crises, succumbs to plague after spending weeks tending to sick parishioners. His death feels like a personal betrayal by God, leaving you spiritually orphaned at the moment you most need divine guidance. Church services, once communal gatherings that reinforced faith and community bonds, become dangerous breeding grounds for disease transmission. The very act of gathering to worship God now seems like a potential death sentence. creating an impossible dilemma between spiritual duty and physical survival. Some parishes continue holding services with greatly reduced attendance, while others suspend religious gatherings entirely. The Catholic Church's teachings about suffering, redemption, and divine justice seem inadequate to explain the plague's random devastation. Theology that makes sense during normal times, the idea that God tests the faithful through hardship, becomes hollow when faced with mass death that shows no correlation with moral behavior. Innocent children die while murderers survive, challenging every comfortable assumption about cosmic fairness. Pilgrimages, once considered spiritually beneficial and potentially protective, become exercises in mass suicide. Groups of faithful believers who journey to holy sites, hoping to earn divine protection, instead spread plague across vast geographical areas. The roads to Santiago de Compostela and Canterbury become littered with the corpses of pilgrims who died pursuing salvation. Some religious communities respond to the crisis by embracing extreme asceticism, believing that additional self-punishment might appease God's wrath. Flagellants roam the countryside, whipping themselves bloody, while proclaiming that the plague represents divine punishment for humanity's sins. These groups attract followers who find comfort in the idea that suffering serves a higher purpose, even as their practices spread disease and create social chaos. The church hierarchy struggles to maintain authority as local priests die or flee, leaving communities without spiritual leadership. Bishops attempt to provide guidance through written proclamations, but their advice often conflicts with practical survival needs. Official church doctrine discourages fleeing from plague-stricken areas, arguing that accepting death demonstrates faith. But many clergy ignore this guidance and abandon their posts. Historians still argue whether the Black Death strengthened or weakened medieval Christianity in the long term. But your immediate experience involves watching institutional religion fail to provide satisfactory answers to existential questions. The Church's inability to protect its most devoted followers creates lasting skepticism about clerical authority and traditional religious teachings. Popular religious practices evolve rapidly in response to the crisis. New saints emerge, people who died caring for plague victims, while traditional saints lose relevance when their intercession fails to prevent death. The cult of Saint Roch, who supposedly survived plague, gains popularity, while established saints like Saint Christopher face declining devotion when their protection proves ineffective. The plague spawns new forms of religious expression that blend Christianity with folk beliefs and superstition. People create protective amulets, combining Christian symbols with pagan elements, reasoning that if traditional prayers don't work, perhaps older forms of spiritual protection might prove more effective. These hybrid practices horrify church authorities, but provide psychological comfort to desperate believers. Confession becomes complicated when priests are unavailable or too frightened to hear dying people's final words. The Church develops emergency procedures, allowing laypeople to perform last rites. But these innovations feel desperate improvisations rather than sacred rituals. The spiritual comfort that confession once provided diminishes when performed by neighbors instead of ordained clergy. Some communities experience religious revival as survivors interpret their survival as evidence of divine favor. But these movements often develop heretical characteristics that challenge church authority. Self-proclaimed prophets emerge claiming special knowledge about God's plans, while mystical movements promise direct spiritual experience that bypasses traditional clerical mediation. The economic impact of the plague on religious institutions creates additional spiritual crises. Monasteries lose both personnel and financial support as their patron families die out, leading to the abandonment of religious houses that took centuries to establish. Churches struggle to maintain basic operations without sufficient clergy or lay support, creating a visible decline in religious infrastructure that reflects deeper spiritual uncertainties. Prayer itself becomes problematic when earnest requests for protection repeatedly go unanswered. Communities that organize mass prayer sessions to end the plague watch their efforts fail repeatedly, leading some people to conclude that either God doesn't exist, doesn't care about human suffering, or actively desires the destruction of Christian civilization. You're witnessing one of humanity's most shameful responses to crisis, the systematic persecution of innocent people who become convenient targets for misdirected fear and rage. The plague creates such overwhelming anxiety that communities desperately search for someone to blame. And unfortunately, marginalized groups become easy scapegoats for a disease that nobody understands. Jewish communities across Europe face particularly horrific persecution based on the completely fabricated accusation that they're deliberately poisoning wells to spread plague. This conspiracy theory makes no logical sense. Jewish people are dying from plague at the same rates as everyone else. But logic has little influence on panic-driven mob violence. You watch neighbors who once conducted peaceful business with Jewish merchants suddenly transform into bloodthirsty accusers, demanding violent retribution. Well-poisoning accusations follow a predictable pattern in community after community. Someone notices that a Jewish family survived longer than expected, or observes Jewish religious practices that seem unusual, and suddenly wild theories about deliberate plague spreading begin circulating. These rumors spread faster than the plague itself, carried by terrified people who prefer believing in human enemies they can fight rather than accepting their helplessness against disease. Entire Jewish communities face destruction through coordinated violence that masquerades as religious justice. In Strasbourg, authorities burned 2,000 Jewish residents alive, claiming they're preventing further plague transmission. Similar massacres occur across Germanic territories, with local Christian populations convincing themselves that murdering their Jewish neighbors will somehow end the pandemic. The persecution extends beyond Jewish communities to include other marginalized groups. Lepers, already stigmatized and isolated, face increased hostility as people blame them for spreading disease. Beggars and travelers become suspect simply for moving between communities, while foreign merchants find themselves accused of deliberately importing plague from distant lands. Some authorities attempt to protect Jewish communities, recognizing the accusations as baseless, but they often lack sufficient power to prevent mob violence. Pope Clement VI issues papal bulls condemning the persecution and pointing out that Jewish people are dying from plague in regions where they have no Christian neighbors. But his rational arguments carry little weight against popular hysteria. The economic motivations behind persecution become obvious when you observe which Jewish families face the worst treatment. Wealthy Jewish moneylenders and merchants who hold debts from Christian borrowers mysteriously become the primary targets of plague-related accusations. Their deaths and the destruction of their records conveniently eliminate financial obligations that many Christian debtors would prefer to avoid paying. Historians still argue whether plague-related persecution represented genuine religious fervor or calculated economic opportunism disguised as spiritual cleansing. But from your street-level perspective, the distinction matters little. You're watching neighbors commit acts of shocking brutality against people who have lived peacefully in your community for generations. The persecution creates its own cycle of violence and instability that makes the plague crisis even worse. Jewish physicians, who often possessed superior medical knowledge compared to their Christian counterparts, flee or die, depriving communities of potential healthcare providers during a medical emergency. Jewish merchants, who facilitated trade networks, disappear, further disrupting economic activity. Some Christian communities resist the persecution, either from moral conviction or practical recognition that their Jewish neighbors pose no threat. These communities often experience less social chaos during the plague years, suggesting that maintaining community solidarity provides better survival outcomes than engaging in scapegoating violence. The long-term consequences of plague-related persecution extend far beyond the immediate violence. Jewish communities that survive the massacres often relocate to Eastern Europe, permanently altering the demographic and cultural landscape of the continent. The precedent of blaming minority groups for natural disasters establishes patterns of scapegoating that recur during future crises. Children growing up during the plague years witness adults engaging in behavior that contradicts every moral principle they've been taught about Christian charity and neighborly love. This creates lasting psychological damage and social trauma that influences European culture for generations, normalizing the idea that desperate circumstances justify abandoning ethical principles. The failure of religious and political authorities to effectively prevent persecution undermines their moral authority and social legitimacy. Communities lose faith not just in God's protection, but in human institutions' ability to maintain justice and order during crisis situations. Women, particularly those who practice folk medicine or midwifery, face accusations of witchcraft when their patients die despite treatment. The line between healing and harming becomes blurred in the minds of desperate people looking for someone to blame for their losses, leading to violence against traditional healers who might actually provide more effective care than trained physicians. You're experiencing the complete breakdown of family structures that once provided life's most fundamental source of security and meaning. The plague doesn't just take individual lives, it systematically destroys the bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives, siblings, and extended relatives, leaving you emotionally orphaned even if you physically survive. The first casualty is the natural protective instinct between family members. When your youngest child develops the telltale fever and swollen lymph nodes, every parental instinct screams at you to comfort and care for them. But you're also acutely aware that close contact with plague victims almost guarantees infection. You face an impossible choice: abandon your dying child to protect the rest of your family, or risk everyone's lives to provide comfort during final moments. Traditional death rituals that normally help families process grief become impossible to perform safely. When your spouse dies after 3 days of agonizing illness, you can't hold a proper wake, invite mourners to pay respects, or even safely prepare the body for burial. Instead, you wrap your life partner in whatever cloth you can find and drag them to a mass grave where they'll be buried anonymously alongside dozens of other plague victims. The extended family network that typically provides support during crises completely collapses. Your elderly parents, who normally would move in with you during their final years, become potential disease vectors that you can't safely house. Your siblings, who once shared childhood memories and adult responsibilities, now view each other with suspicion and maintain distance to protect their own immediate families. Child mortality reaches levels that make normal childhood seem like a statistical miracle. Families that once celebrated multiple births now watch helplessly as plague claims infant after infant. Some parents develop a fatalistic detachment from their children, reasoning that emotional investment in beings so likely to die only increases suffering. This psychological defense mechanism fractures parent-child bonds in ways that affect surviving children throughout their lives. Marriage relationships face unprecedented strain as couples struggle with conflicting survival instincts. Some spouses demonstrate remarkable loyalty, caring for each other until death despite obvious risks. Others abandon their partners at the first sign of illness, prioritizing personal survival over wedding vows. The plague reveals which marriages were based on genuine affection and which were merely convenient economic arrangements. Orphaned children become a visible symbol of social breakdown. Kids who lose their parents to plague often lack anyone willing or able to adopt them, since most families are already struggling to care for their own members. These orphans roam the streets in feral packs, forming substitute family structures based on mutual survival rather than blood relationships. The normal process of intergenerational knowledge transfer gets interrupted when entire families die within days of each other. Grandparents who possessed crucial information about farming techniques, craft skills, family history, and survival strategies take this knowledge to their graves before they can pass it on to younger generations. This represents a permanent loss of cultural continuity that affects communities for centuries. Historians still argue whether the Black Death's impact on family structures ultimately benefited women by giving them more independence. But from your immediate perspective, the destruction feels entirely negative. The support systems that once provided security during illness, old age, and economic hardship have vanished, leaving individuals to face existential threats without the collective strength that families normally provide. Pregnancy and childbirth become even more dangerous than usual when plague strikes communities. Pregnant women who contract the disease often miscarry or die in childbirth, while newborns face extremely high mortality rates. Some families make the heartbreaking decision to avoid having children entirely, reasoning that bringing new life into a plague-infected world constitutes cruelty. The psychological trauma of losing multiple family members in rapid succession creates lasting mental health problems that medieval society lacks the knowledge or resources to address. Survivors often develop what modern psychologists would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but they must cope with their symptoms without professional support or even basic understanding of psychological healing. Family property and inheritance become complicated when entire households die simultaneously. Legal systems designed to handle individual deaths prove inadequate when faced with mass mortality that wipes out multiple generations at once. Valuable property sits abandoned because there are no surviving relatives to claim it, while inheritance disputes create additional conflict among communities already struggling with crisis. The traditional role of elderly family members as sources of wisdom and guidance disappears when plague claims older adults at high rates. Young people must make crucial decisions about survival, work, and relationships without the benefit of experienced advice from parents or grandparents who might have lived through previous crises. Caregiving roles within families become impossibly dangerous. Adult children who normally would care for aging parents must choose between filial duty and personal survival. The moral weight of these decisions creates guilt and psychological trauma that affects survivors long after the plague itself has ended. Some families attempt to maintain bonds through creative adaptations, communicating through windows, leaving food at a distance, or sharing final messages through intermediaries. But these desperate measures only emphasize how fundamentally the plague has altered the most basic human relationships, turning family love into a potential death sentence. You're experiencing a level of social isolation that modern quarantine measures can barely approximate. The plague forces you into a terrifying solitude where human contact, the most basic psychological need, becomes potentially lethal. Every person you encounter might be carrying death, and every person who encounters you might die from something you're unknowingly transmitting. Quarantine practices, primitive by modern standards, become exercises in psychological torture. When plague strikes your household, authorities mark your door with a red cross and seal you inside with infected family members. You're trapped in a small space with people who are coughing blood, developing grotesque swellings, and slowly dying in agony. The isolation that's supposed to protect your community becomes a death sentence for your family. The marking system used to identify infected households creates a medieval version of social leprosy. Neighbors who once greeted you warmly now cross the street to avoid any chance of contact. Children who played with your kids now throw stones at your windows while chanting rhymes about plague carriers. You become a walking symbol of contamination that must be avoided at all costs. Mental health, never well understood in medieval times, deteriorates rapidly under isolation conditions. Without the constant social interaction that normally provides emotional support and psychological stability, you begin experiencing what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. But medieval society lacks both the vocabulary to describe these conditions and the knowledge to treat them effectively. The few people willing to maintain contact with plague households often become suspect themselves. Priests who continue visiting infected families to provide last rites find themselves shunned by their congregations. Physicians who treat plague victims discover that their other patients refuse to see them. Even family members who survive plague infection face ongoing social stigma that can last for years. Communication becomes limited to shouting across distances or passing written messages through intermediaries. The subtle social cues that normally govern human interaction, facial expressions, body language, physical proximity, disappear, making all relationships feel artificial and strained. You lose the ability to truly connect with other people, creating a profound sense of alienation that affects your basic sense of humanity. Isolation creates practical problems that compound the psychological trauma. When you're sealed inside your home with plague victims, you can't obtain fresh food, clean water, or medical supplies. Well-meaning neighbors might leave provisions outside your door, but they often can't provide enough to sustain an entire household for weeks or months of quarantine. The isolation extends beyond physical separation to include informational isolation. Cut off from normal social networks, you lose access to news about the plague's progression, survival strategies, or potential treatments. Rumors and misinformation spread faster than accurate information, leaving you to make life or death decisions based on incomplete or false information. Historians still argue whether medieval quarantine practices actually reduced plague transmission or simply created additional suffering without significant public health benefits. From your perspective, as someone trapped in isolation, the effectiveness of quarantine matters less than the immediate experience of watching loved ones die, while being unable to seek help or comfort from your community. Some people attempt to escape quarantine by breaking out of sealed houses or bribing guards to allow passage. These escape attempts rarely succeed and often result in violent confrontations with authorities who view quarantine violators as potential mass murderers willing to spread disease throughout the community. The psychological impact of isolation becomes particularly severe for children who lack the emotional maturity to understand why they've been suddenly cut off from friends, extended family, and normal social activities. Kids who survive plague isolation often develop lasting social anxiety and difficulty forming close relationships with others. Sleep becomes nearly impossible when you're trapped in close quarters with dying family members. The sounds of labored breathing, delirious raving, and death rattles continue around the clock, while the smell of sickness and decomposition makes every breath a reminder of your probable fate. Exhaustion weakens your immune system at the exact moment you most need physical strength to fight infection. Religious isolation compounds the psychological trauma, since quarantined families often can't receive proper spiritual care during their final moments. The comfort that last rites and confession might normally provide becomes unavailable, leaving people to face death without the religious support that medieval society considers essential for salvation. The isolation creates a distorted sense of time where days blur together in an endless cycle of fear, boredom, and grief. Without normal social rhythms to mark the passage of time, work schedules, meal times with neighbors, community gatherings, you lose track of whether you've been quarantined for days, weeks, or months. Some quarantined families develop elaborate internal rituals and games to maintain psychological stability. But these coping mechanisms often break down when family members begin dying. The creative adaptations that initially help preserve sanity become impossible to maintain as grief and fear overwhelm your ability to think rationally about survival. You're making moral compromises that would have been unthinkable during normal times. But survival during the plague requires abandoning peacetime ethics in favor of desperate pragmatism. Every decision becomes a calculation between competing evils, and the choices you make to stay alive often contradict everything you once believed about right and wrong. Food becomes scarce enough that you consider stealing from neighbors, even though you've been raised to believe that theft is both sinful and socially destructive. The baker who normally sells bread has either died or fled the city, leaving you to choose between starving and taking food that technically belongs to someone else. The moral clarity that once guided your actions disappears when faced with immediate physical need. You're forced to step over corpses in the street to reach the few shops that remain open, becoming callously indifferent to human remains that would have horrified you just months earlier. Dead bodies become obstacles to navigate around rather than people deserving respectful burial. This psychological numbing protects your sanity, but transforms you into someone you wouldn't have recognized before the plague. The economics of survival create opportunities for profit that feel morally questionable, but practically necessary. You might purchase goods from families who are desperately selling possessions to buy food, knowing that you're taking advantage of their desperation. Or you might charge higher prices for services because you're one of the few people still capable of providing them, even though this means profiting from others' misfortune. Healthcare decisions become brutal calculations about resource allocation. When multiple family members fall ill simultaneously, you must decide who gets the limited medicine, clean water, and care attention available. These choices often mean actively deciding who lives and who dies among people you love, creating psychological trauma that affects survivors for the rest of their lives. Some survival strategies require you to become complicit in social breakdown. You might need to join groups that hoard essential supplies, even though this means other families will starve. Or you might have to support quarantine measures that you know will doom infected households, because opposing them might result in your own family being targeted for isolation. The plague creates a black market economy where normal commercial ethics don't apply. You find yourself trading with grave robbers who sell clothing stripped from corpses, or purchasing food from merchants who have looted abandoned houses. These transactions feel disgusting, but represent your only access to survival necessities. Child survival becomes so precarious that some families make heartbreaking decisions about resource allocation. Parents might focus their limited food and care on children who seem most likely to survive, essentially abandoning siblings who appear too weak or too sick to have realistic chances. These triage decisions contradict every instinct about parental love, but may represent the only way to save anyone. Historians still argue whether the moral compromises required for plague survival created lasting changes in European ethical systems. But from your immediate perspective, the philosophical implications matter less than getting through each day alive. You're discovering that civilization is a luxury that becomes impossible to maintain when survival is at stake. Religious obligations conflict with survival needs in ways that force you to choose between spiritual and physical welfare. Attending church services might be necessary for salvation, but also increases your risk of contracting plague from other worshippers. Caring for sick neighbors demonstrates Christian charity, but endangers your family's survival. The breakdown of law enforcement means that violence becomes a viable survival strategy. You might need to physically defend your food supplies from desperate neighbors, or use threats of violence to maintain control over resources necessary for your family's survival. These actions contradict your peaceful nature, but seem preferable to passive starvation. Information becomes a survival resource that you guard carefully. Knowledge about which areas of the city remain safe, which merchants still have goods to sell, or which physicians are still alive, gives you advantages that could mean the difference between life and death. Sharing this information might help your community, but also increases competition for scarce resources. Some survival strategies require you to become socially predatory in ways that that would have been unthinkable during normal times. You might exploit others' desperation to obtain goods and services at below market prices, or take advantage of social chaos to settle old scores with people who wronged you in the past. The psychological cost of these survival compromises affects your sense of personal identity and moral worth. You're becoming someone who can steal, lie, abandon others, and make coldly calculated decisions about life and death. Part of you recognizes that these adaptations are necessary for survival, but another part mourns the loss of the person you used to be. You're learning to coexist with death in ways that fundamentally alter your relationship with life itself. The plague has made dying so commonplace that it becomes background noise rather than a shocking tragedy. And this normalization of mortality changes how you think about everything from daily planning to long-term dreams. Mass graves become as familiar as market squares once were. You walk past enormous pits filled with hundreds of corpses and feel nothing more than mild irritation that the smell interferes with your breakfast. The elaborate funeral rituals that once helped communities process grief become impossible when people are dying faster than they can be properly buried. Death becomes an industrial process rather than a personal tragedy. Your daily routine now includes tasks that would have been unimaginable during normal times. You might spend mornings checking which neighbors died overnight, afternoons helping to drag bodies to collection points, and evenings planning how to redistribute resources left by the deceased. This constant exposure to death creates a psychological numbness that protects your sanity, but also diminishes your capacity for normal human emotions. Planning for the future becomes almost impossible when you're uncertain whether you'll survive the next week. Long-term goals like learning new skills, building relationships, or improving your living situation seem pointless when plague might kill you before you can enjoy the benefits. This creates a strange kind of fatalism where you focus entirely on immediate pleasures and necessities while abandoning most forms of delayed gratification. The plague's randomness teaches you that death has nothing to do with moral worth, personal effort, or divine favor. Good people die horrible deaths, while terrible people survive unscathed, forcing you to abandon comfortable beliefs about cosmic justice and meaningful suffering. This recognition of life's fundamental arbitrariness affects how you think about everything from personal responsibility to religious faith. Relationships become more intense, but also more provisional. Knowing that anyone you care about might die tomorrow makes every interaction feel precious, but it also makes emotional investment feel dangerous. Some people respond by loving more deeply, while others protect themselves by maintaining emotional distance from everyone around them. You develop a kind of practical expertise in death-related logistics that would have been unthinkable before the plague. You know how to recognize when someone is about to die, how to prepare bodies for disposal, how to distribute a deceased person's possessions, and how to comfort survivors. These skills make you valuable to your community, but also mark you as someone who's intimately familiar with humanity's worst experiences. The physical landscape around you becomes permanently altered by mass death. Empty houses outnumber occupied ones. Abandoned fields revert to wilderness, and entire neighborhoods sit vacant except for scavenging animals. This visual reminder of mortality affects your psychological state every time you step outside, making it impossible to forget that civilization is more fragile than you once believed. Children who grow up during plague years develop a completely different relationship with death than previous generations. They play games that incorporate plague themes, treat corpses as normal parts of the environment, and discuss death with a casualness that would horrify adults who remember pre-plague times. This generational difference creates lasting cultural changes that persist long after the disease itself has ended. Historians still argue whether the Black Death's normalization of death ultimately made European culture more accepting of mortality or more desperate to avoid it. But from your lived experience, the constant presence of death creates a strange kind of liberation. When you truly accept that death is random and inevitable, many of the anxieties that once dominated your thinking seem less important. Some people find unexpected peace in accepting their probable fate. Instead of fighting desperately against the inevitable, they focus on making their remaining time meaningful through acts of service, creative expression, or spiritual contemplation. This acceptance doesn't eliminate fear, but transforms it into something more manageable. The plague forces you to confront the reality that human civilization is much more fragile than you once believed. Social institutions, economic systems, and cultural traditions that seemed permanent can disappear within months when faced with sufficient mortality. This recognition affects how you think about everything from political authority to personal achievements. Sleep becomes different when you're surrounded by constant death. You develop the ability to rest despite the smell of decomposition, the sounds of neighbors dying, and the knowledge that you might not wake up tomorrow. This adaptation represents both a practical survival skill and a profound psychological adjustment to living in a world where death is omnipresent. Your sense of time changes when the future becomes so uncertain. Days feel both endless and fleeting, endless because of the constant anxiety and suffering, but fleeting because you're never sure how many you have left. This temporal disorientation affects how you prioritize activities and relationships, often leading to choices that would seem irrational during normal times. As months pass and you somehow continue surviving, you begin to wonder whether you're simply lucky or if you possess some special resistance to the disease. This uncertainty creates its own form of psychological stress, since you can never relax completely or assume that your survival is guaranteed. Every morning brings the question of whether today will be the day your luck runs out. The wind down begins here, as the harsh realities of plague life slowly give way to a gentler acknowledgement of human endurance. Your breathing slows as you realize that even in humanity's darkest hours, people found ways to continue living, loving, and hoping for something better. The candle beside your bed flickers softly, casting dancing shadows on the wall as you settle deeper into your covers. Outside, the modern world continues its quiet nighttime rhythm, so different from those plague-torn medieval cities, where silence meant death and sound meant suffering. You're safe now, wrapped in the comfort of contemporary medicine, sanitation, and social systems that your medieval ancestors could never have imagined. As sleep approaches, let yourself feel grateful for the simple miracle of living in an age where diseases like the Black Death represent historical curiosities rather than immediate threats. Your ancestors' struggles weren't meaningless. They laid the foundation for the safer, healthier world you inhabit today. The story of the Great Plague reminds us that human resilience can survive even the most devastating challenges. Those who lived through the Black Death weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when faced with unimaginable adversity. Their survival ensured that you could exist in this moment, listening to their story from the safety of your own bed. Close your eyes now and let the weight of historical knowledge settle peacefully in your mind. The plague years are long past, but the lessons they teach about courage, adaptation, and hope remain eternally relevant. Rest well, knowing that you carry within you the genetic inheritance of survivors who refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. Sleep comes easier when you remember that every challenge, no matter how overwhelming, eventually passes into memory and then into history. Good night.